Hello, we're beginning our second of three sections. This one is on special education. Now, changes began in these populations in the 1960s, paralleling the civil rights movement. The initial pivotal case was Park versus Board of Education was in 1967, with parents asking for schooling for their intellectually disabled children. The case was in Pennsylvania, where it was legal to deny educational services to any child who was 8 years old but functioning on or below a 5-year-old level. The case was brought under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees equal protection under the law. The court agreed with the parents. A year later, an award-winning documentary, Suffer the Children, 5 10-minute episodes, was filmed at Pennsylvania Pennhurst State School, an institution where children with a variety of difficulties were placed. They included the feeble-minded, epileptics, orphans, immigrants, criminals. This documentary is grim viewing of an overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded facility. Neglect and abuse was rampant. There were several court cases. Ultimately, Pennhurst was closed in 1987. You can watch the entire documentary here. It began the deinstitutionalization process, which eventually went nationwide. South Carolina was not much different from Pennsylvania. At that time, placing disabled individuals in asylum settings was considered best for all, although there were those families that elected to keep disabled family members at home. The first 3 facilities here still operate with a much reduced caseload, and it's not easy to place someone here. In 1973, Public Law 93-380 was passed, which required states to offer special education services. A year later, Public Law 94-142 was passed. It defined handicapping conditions and attached some funding. This law was reauthorized in 1990 as IDEA and again reauthorized in 2004 as IDEIA. IDEIA defines handicapping conditions. It requires schools to look for individuals who may be handicapped. More on this later. Parental awareness, notification, and consent is required for all steps of the process. Special education emphasizes remediation, trying to fix the problem, and modification, changing the environment so the disabled individual can still participate. Okay, we always look for adverse educational impact. And there is funding, and I will tell you now there are some children who are very, very expensive. Currently, nationwide, about 14% of all school-age children receive some form of special education or related services. Here in South Carolina, we have 13 classifications. We've talked about some of these: ID, intellectual disability, and learning disability. There's also emotional disability, which is not the same thing as behavioral disordered or delinquent. There are the sensory impairments, including visually impaired and hearing impaired, and the physical impairments, orthopedically disabled. Be cautious here. Not every student in a wheelchair needs special education. There's also other health impaired, which includes medically based disorder. Again, we have to be cautious as not every child with a medical disorder requires special education. These disorders can include epilepsy, ADHD, cystic fibrosis. We've added 2 disorders in 1990: traumatic brain injury. This is a population with vast differences in functioning, and autism, now ASD. Previously, children with autism were placed as emotionally disabled. This was before we convinced people that we were dealing with a neurological issue, not poor parenting. 2 of the smallest groups are multiply handicapped, usually a sensory impairment and something else, and the smallest group, deaf-blind, which requires some very different types of instruction from visually impaired or hearing handicapped. Now, the largest group, some of you may have participated in this category, is speech-language impaired. And lastly, a group first defined in 1986 are preschool children with disabilities. They begin at age 3 in the public schools. I want to focus now on learning disabilities. South Carolina, like most states, used to rely on the discrepancy formula. Achievement had to be significantly below cognition. There were numerous problems with this formula. We called it the wait to fail model. More recently, South Carolina relies on documentation of resistance to intervention. Do you remember how I shared that if we intervened with a phonemic awareness disorder, we could sometimes fix it? If we intervene and the disorder does not get better and reading remains below grade level, we may want to consider LD programming. We also look at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses along with RTI. This is where that cross-battery assessment information identifies a significant weakness, say in phonemic awareness, that will underpin a reading disability. Many districts want both pieces of information before considering LD programming. Now these are the areas that a person may be considered for support services as learning disabled. Now, on this last slide, I want to talk about some special education terms. Mainstream is regular education. LRE is least restrictive environment. The law requires that students be placed in the setting closest to the mainstream and, this is important, that can confer educational benefit. The next 5 will refer to the level of services. Itinerant is special education services that total less than 5 hours a week. Speech and language programming is usually offered on an itinerant schedule. Resource is special education services that total more than 5 hours but less than 15, between 1 to 3 periods. Self-contained is special ed services that total more than 15 hours a week, more than half the day. We have to document that for these students there is some contact with the educational mainstream for some part of the day, or say why this is not in the student's best interest. Inclusion is a design in which the student remains in the mainstream class, but the special ed teacher comes in to work with him or her. This can be done in a co-teaching model or by having the special ed teacher pull students who need assistance, both special ed and non-special ed, to the back of the room in conducting a small group. Now some other terms. FAPE is free and appropriate public education. All children, special ed and non-special ed, are entitled to a free public school education. SAT is Student Assistance Team. Earlier I mentioned that schools have to look for children that might be handicapped. We also call that child find. Okay. They do this by scheduling regular meetings of a student assistance team, a group which includes the parent, the teacher, an administrator, and other support staff, such as a guidance counselor, a speech clinician, the school psychologist. For older students, the students themselves may be included. IEP is Individual Education Program. Your book is wrong when it uses the word plan instead of program. This is a lengthy document. It specifies the nature of special education support services, when and how often, along with addressing if the student needs any accommodation in PE, for group testing, for discipline, among other things. Lastly is ESY, or Extended School Year. This is offered to prevent a student from regressing more than is typical. This is based on the student's historical performance. It can be also offered to students who are on the cusp of mastering an important skill. This is not summer school. This is not designed to get the student caught up or ahead. Usually services are somewhere between 5 to 15 hours spread across the summer, sometimes in a one-on-one setting, sometimes in a small group. One of the most common groups to get this service are those apraxiphagia students, that's speech and language individuals, who have been noted to regress even over a weekend. That's a lot of information, but this is the end of Section 2. Next is Section 3. We'll talk about specialized education and accountability.